Okay, let me start. There is a slight shift in the topic of the paper, which more concretely deals with a particular aspect within my research, which I'm currently working, and this is sort of more work in progress, and I would like to share this with you. This is actually, it deals concretely with the compensation paid to British slave owners at the end of slavery in the 1830s, and I show its current reassessment, this compensation payments, by Caribbean and in particular by Jamaican scholars who advocate for slavery reparations. And I emphasize how they use the compensation records, the archives, as a crucial argument in favor of their claims. Jamaica is a forerunner for the historical global struggle for reparations and is an important player in the CARICOM Reparations Commission. And this commission, since 2013, calls upon European governments to engage in measures of reparations, basically sought as infrastructural investments in areas of education, health, culture, and development. For more information on this particular agenda of CARICOM and its transnational outreach, as well as on the history of the Caribbean reparation calls, please consider the article I circulated previously, which deals more the general topic of the agenda and the history. So today I really want to focus on the compensation payments and its reassessment. And just a few words to my empirical data. So it is based on interviews I conducted in Kingston in the years 2014, 17, and 20 with some members of the National Council for Reparations, which is the first founded in the region with support of the Jamaican government in 2009 already. It is composed actually by scholars, basically historians, but also other scholars from the University of the West Indies, by human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, and cultural workers. And they all came across the topic through their own research on slavery. And most of them, beyond their professions, also publicly advocate for reparations, both in Jamaica, but also internationally. So clearly here, their academic and political interests as activists are intertwined, right? Maybe one of the main crucial argument for their claims is that they rely on the compensation paid to British slave owners at the end of slavery in 1834 and onwards. The British Parliament paid actually 20 million golden pounds to the planters, the slave owners, an amount they claimed as property, as they considered their slaves in the Caribbean colonies as property, as movable chattels they have paid for. The enslaved persons, on the other hand, went into freedom without any compensation for the injuries they suffered. They were not even yet free, as the British implemented the system of apprenticeship, forcing, so this was a system actually of forced labor, forcing the now formerly free people for another period than 4 years, which was originally designed even for 12 years, to remain working on the plantations, very often for the same masters without being paid. So this British model of compensated emancipation was actually a precedent and later followed in the French and Dutch West Indies, partly also in Cuba and in Puerto Rico, as well as in Brazil. All over the Americas, the gradual abolition of slavery went along with some form of compensation to slave owners that could entail cash, loans, labor, lands, goods, animals, and in some cases, a combination of these. Nowhere has the compensation so precisely administrated and documented as in Great Britain, which is considered by the Jamaican activists of great benefit for their case, of course. So Caribbean historians conducted research on the records already in the 1980s, but interestingly for a broader public, in particular beyond academia, it became only known in 2013 when the online database Legacies of the British Slave Ownership was launched by Catherine Hall, Nicholas Draper, and their research team from University College London. This database provides the first open access to the slave compensation records, documenting the different amounts of money each planter got for how many enslaved persons and which sugar estate. And this allows precisely approach slavery as a system that is personally traceable. And this relies foremost on Draper's book, The Price of Emancipation, where he shows that 20 million golden pounds, it was a huge amount of money in that time, representing about 40% of the national budget, the national income. So 80% went actually to absentee owners. That means owners of Caribbean plantations who resided in Great Britain and who have never set a foot in the colonies. So most of this profit was reinvested in British infrastructure and stimulated a burst of economic growth in the mid-19th century. Draper and his colleagues enabled to trace back the consequences of the compensation in terms of intergenerational transfer of capital in cash, investment, and social status. It highlights that slave ownership was not marginal, but actually central to British society in the 1830s, where a good majority of the national elite, including members of the British Parliament, had financial or family ties to slavery economy. So, but what interests me in my research is not in detail that database as such, but the way how Caribbean and Jamaican activists use this database and related research in order to support their argument. So they trace the subsequent investments British slave owners undertook with that money, but even more importantly, and that is the focus in my research, they put the spotlight on the other side of that wealth, which is the impoverishment of the Caribbean colonies, of those who remained without any compensation. So I start with a quote I had with Professor Maureen Warner-Lewis, and I don't want to read it because this costs too much time. But in this quote, actually, Professor Warner-Lewis draws the attention to the long-term effects of non-compensation. She further states that within her own fieldwork on African oral traditions, she came across historical narratives which refer to the compensation of slave owners as injustice done and also as blood money owed. So this expression, blood money owed, encompasses the notion that compensation is owed to the descendants of the enslaved and not to the enslavers. This is also a point Rupert Lewis, her husband, has raised. He is a political scientist and highly engaged in the reparations struggle since the 1980s already. And he emphasizes the general notion of injustice experienced that still resonates strongly within Jamaican society, exemplified, for instance, in land inequalities. From this, he draws a straight argument in favor of the claims. So actually, the activists feel that the social, economic, political, cultural, and psychological injuries caused by slavery have never been settled, neither after slavery ended, nor within the ongoing period of colonial domination, and not even, and that's interesting, not even after Jamaican independence in 1962. So they argue that Great Britain owes the Caribbean some form of reparations, not only for the injustice of slavery, and compensation paid to slave owners, but also for having left its colonies undeveloped after independence and still benefiting from colonial structures persisting in so many dimensions of the society, such as you can see very briefly, in land inequalities, in the economic structure, the political and legal system, in the bad state of education and health system, in family and gender relations, and generally in patterns of colonial thought. So obviously, the topic of post-independent problems, for instance, the lack of national sovereignty, and in particular, how both conditions are linked to the reparations discourse, this requires much more research. I can't address this today. Maybe in another moment we have time to go for that. So of course, the Jamaican activists also admit failures of the Jamaican post-colonial governments in really addressing slavery. However, and this is the focus in my work, they point to a major responsibility of the British state and therefore clearly address the state, the British state. So my argument is that when they stress the uneven development between Europe and the Caribbean as a result of slavery, compensation, and colonization or colonialism, they potentially deconstruct the arguments that are always raised against reparations by British politics and general the public sphere. So these counter arguments are basically that slavery happened too long ago, that it is impossible to quantify the damage and therefore impossible to repair the damage. So the counter of this argument, the countering of these arguments is that Jamaican activists, for their part, argue that it is not generally impossible, as the wealth of Great Britain is traceable, and this is shown by the database, similar as the impoverishment of the Caribbean colonies. So when they use the records, their purpose is to emphasize the long-term implications of a structurally related but counter-rotating process. While the wealth of British was passed from one generation to another, the descendants of the enslaved remained, also for generations, disadvantaged in terms of accessing land, property, and capital for doing business and investments. So in this sense, global inequalities are structurally linked to slavery and compensation. And this is maybe the main argument. And obviously, it raises questions of accountability, not only in moral terms. And this leads me to a third dimension, which is the countering of the British politics of denial of recognition. And here I briefly have to touch a particular incident, and this is that research on the compensation records uncovered that one of those slave owners getting compensation was actually the ancestor of former British Prime Minister David Cameron, who owned a sugar plantation in Jamaica with 200 enslaved persons. The Jamaican activists took this prominent case as a mobilizing factor for reparations, in particular when he visited the island in 2015. On the eve of this visit, the National Council for Reparations organized a public lecture where 400 people attended, some of them wearing T-shirts, Mr. Cameron Say Sorry, for instance, and many other activities took place in the eve. So various members of the National Council appealed to Cameron as an individual and as head of a former enslaving state to apologize personally and on behalf of his country. So Sir Hilary Beckles, for instance, historian from Barbados, currently the Vice Chancellor of University of the West Indies and chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So he's obviously the most known spokesperson for the case. So he addressed Cameron in an open letter, pointing out Britain's share in the, I quote, monumental mess of empire left in the Caribbean, and connects this political responsibility to share the present duties. So Cameron's response to the reparation demand, which, by the way, actually was handed him in by former Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller in Jamaica. And his response was, well, more than deceptive. You can read this here. And this position, however, is just another example of the attitude of all other prime ministers before him and the royal family, who for years have rejected the many calls for reparation. So this call is actually not new. The calls are quite old, and in particular in Jamaica, they started already in the 1950s by early Rastafarian claims to the British Queen. But this is another story you can read in the literature. Of course, this statement in Jamaica was perceived widely as an affront, not only by the reparation advocates, but widely beyond this context. And also it resulted in an indignation in national and international media, and of course, as well as among my interview partners. So here just two examples how they reacted to this statement. So they protested against Cameron's refusal to apologize for the crimes of slavery and against his ignorance of any reparation talk. But in particular, they felt affronted by the rhetoric of friends he used as someone whose ancestor benefited from slavery and as someone who represents the still unequal power relations between Great Britain and its former colonies. So in doing so, they contest British politics and the ideology of moving on as cynical and false. And there's another quote for that. So here, interestingly, I do not know if Frank Phipps, my interview partner, unconsciously or intentionally state that Cameron himself had slaves. One might interpret this as a rhetorical style that underlines a crucial argument. It doesn't matter if it was Cameron himself or his ancestor who received the money. The point here is the remaining link, the fact that generations have profited. So moreover, even if Cameron had not benefited as an individual, there's a strong expectation that in his political function as prime minister of a successor state of the principal European enslaving power, he should be open to a dialogue on reparations. So, but yet the story goes on. 3 years later, in 2018, a British bank loan was discovered that once financed the compensation, and that was paid off only in the year 2015. So this has caused another public scandal in Jamaica, which was immediately used by the activists to dismantle Britain's double-faced politics. So they reject the argument, it is too late to talk about slavery, when at the same time, British taxpayers, including those of Caribbean descent, had to pay back a loan until the year 2015 that is clearly linked to slavery. So unfortunately, I don't have time today to explore more on this incident, but you can read this in my forthcoming paper in the journal Sociologus. There are much more informations about the background of this bank loan and how the Jamaicans countered this bank loan and the information circulated around. So I come to my conclusion for today. So obviously, the general reparation argument emphasizes more the structural than the individual traces, but and that is crucial, of course. But the link to, or the reference, let's say, to symbolic prominent figures like Cameron was crucial, as it helped to denounce moral shame, to incite outrage and to mobilize for the case. In this sense, the activist campaigns have widened the public knowledge about the compensation and of slavery in general. And by scandalizing Cameron's denial of recognition, they intervene as academic activists in politics and counter the hierarchy of global power relations. So much more than criticizing his discourse of let's move on, that ignores the concerns of Caribbean societies, it is the power of denial which they lay open. To know about the lawn, but to not act, to not admit historical, moral, and political responsibility. But I would furthermore argue that the refusal of recognition of a historical injustice is in itself an epistemological problem. Who can assert from what position of power and geopolitical knowledge that the past is over, that there are no causal consequences? So how can the past be over for those who have to deal with it, be it in their daily struggles against poverty, against the feeling of being disadvantaged, and against the burden of still suffering from a fundamental violation that has not been acknowledged? So in other words, how can anyone expect them to move away from something that is still going on because it was never dealt with? So this denial of recognition, apology, and restorative measures increases harm in a way that people feel, why are our concerns not taken seriously? So, and I would even argue that this denial of recognition in itself represents one of the most profound legacies of slavery. It is the power to not answer the claims or answer the general demands that the Jamaican activists find unacceptable and therefore counter. So they emphasize that the end of slavery was not the end of suffering, forced labor, colonial injustices, and interrelated dependencies. Instead of conceiving the formal end as a closure of the past, they point to the damage that continues and transcends generations. And they urge for holding an overdue conversation about the unequally shared burdens and profits, insisting that the history of slavery is an entangled history between Europe and the Caribbean, and consequently that the task to confront the legacies must be a shared concern and cannot be left to the Caribbean alone. Finally, although I focus here on the economic, only on the economic and political dimension alone, reparation is about much more than money. It's a holistic process involving history, memory, recognition, cultural and epistemological dimensions. And Jamaica, of course, is just one example of strong advocacy, but the issue as such is vibrant in the entire region, in the United States and beyond. And of course, not only in the Anglophone Caribbean, it resonates also in the Spanish-speaking and French and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. And respective activism might not always be framed in the language of reparations, but the need to redress slavery is extensible to other post-colonial relationships. So my study might encourage further research and political debates on how to come to terms with historical injustices through a framework of reparations that would include slavery, colonialism, and its long-lasting legacies. Thank you. This is my end. Thank you. Thanks for listening, and thank you for your comments.